Today I am going to talk about, you know the title, so I am going to, what I'll be doing is I am not really going to present you with a coherent kind of a paper, but I will be throwing some ideas. And the other thing is, what I'll be dealing with, since time is short, I will be dealing mostly with fiction. I will not be talking about non-fiction as such. I kind of did a little online research, and there were some surprising results that came out of that exploration. And I am going to share my surprise with you here as well. And of course, this will be somewhat inadequate because the lockdown being the lockdown, which we are trying to follow meticulously because this is for the good of the nation. This is not only an individual kind of a thing. So we need to be quite faithful to the restrictions that are being given to us. I am not going to use the word imposed because this is for our own good. So see, in the title, I have used the word apocalypse. What is relevant for my discussion is that when we are talking about the apocalypse, the two terms, I do look at the Encyclopedia Britannica a lot because they have comprehensive discussions on many topics. And when I was looking at the section on apocalypse, two things struck me, and I thought I'd be starting my discussion on this. What the Britannica says is that apocalyptic literature, literary genre that foretells supernaturally inspired cataclysmic events that will transpire at the end of the world. Now I will look at my computer screen once in a while because I have the relevant quotations there. Now the thing is, the first word that I found very interesting is this word supernatural. Now we usually talk about the supernatural in the sense that it is something beyond natural. It is something that is beyond the scope of nature as we know it and understand it. And when we talk about apocalypse, when we talk about such wide mass scale devastation, it does not seem natural to us. Now, this is the first point that I need you to think about. How natural is these apocalyptic events? How natural are they? Now, they are, for instance, I am not really going to talk about this particular pandemic that we are in, because there are a lot of political connotations related to it, and since there are a lot of questions that we have not been able to answer yet. So leaving this particular pandemic aside, if you think about epidemics, even war is considered to be natural because whenever the human population grows out of proportion, people say that wars come in and the population is culled. It's cruel, it's very, very unkind, but perhaps there is some kind of necessity. I mean, this is not my opinion, but this is certain things that certain people believe in. So what I'm trying to talk about here that when nature is imposing its structure on us, then we see a kind of superior face of nature. When nature kind of supervenes on our flimsy ideas of civilization, progression and all that. So nature becomes supernature and it affects humanity so as to create a kind of control, because as we know, humanity is more about destruction than construction, and the capacity of cohabitation that humanity has is tragically low. So we can't really cohabit with other species. We tend to destroy them, domesticate them, utilize them, etc. So nature has to take up this superior form to control humanity. And when we talk about apocalyptic literature, the predominant mood that we have, and this is when from the Britannica as well, is a pessimistic view. Because if you look at apocalyptic literature or literature of apocalypse, it might be literature of war, it might be literature of famine, it might be literature of diseases, epidemics. What we have is an essentially pessimistic mood. There are optimistic literatures as well, but pessimism is not very secretly included. And we have so many kinds of apocalypse. It can be, as I said, pandemics, wars, famines. It can be a global kind of a thing. We seem to have one global pandemic every 100 years, as it seems. And it can be a local apocalypse as well. There are so many epidemics which devastate certain regions, and we don't really get to know living in a separate region. So all these things, all these phenomena, they have a human involvement as well. Nature creates something. Nature can create a disease. Famine is sometimes nature created, sometimes it's a result of human agency. War is mostly seen as human agency. So war is when someone attacks and someone defends, and it's a very simplified kind of a definition. I mean, it's much more complicated than that. But there are two things. One is the function of nature, the role of nature, also the function of the state. That is something that we cannot forget. I would request you to remember this. I am not really going to talk about it in any detail as such, because literature is my concern, not politics or political science. But you need to remember that when a nation fails to contain an epidemic within its boundaries, then one might think that there might be some responsibility that can be attached to that. I'm again not talking about the current pandemic, but this is an idea of containment, how the state mechanisms are supposed to play a major role. In fact, in controlling hunger, in controlling disease, in controlling war. Because when you are becoming aggressive with imperial intentions, then you are not only violating the human rights of the target nation, but you are also violating the human rights of your own citizens, because you are using them as soldiers. They are the enactors of violence which will give you the empire. Again, simplified, but that is the key thing. But what I need you to do is to think about these things. And if it's a case of civil war or famine, then you see the dynamics are totally changing, and it's a state-related thing. And but of course, what we need to remember that we have the citizens to blame as well, because when we are talking about a democratic setup, you can't really absolve the citizens from this. What I'll do now is give you a list of certain texts which come up whenever you are talking about literature of disease. And I'll just give you this list. I'm not really going to talk about this list. I am going to talk about this list, not of the texts on these lists as such, but just take a look at this list. Now, what is very interesting about this list is that you have a large number of Western texts. But when we come to India, it's difficult to find texts which are focusing, I mean again, fiction. I'm not talking about non-fiction. There are a lot of non-fictional texts on this. But fiction, novels, theatre, even poetry as such, you can't really find a very huge number of texts on such themes. Now, why is this phenomenon there? I will be coming back because this is my primary idea behind this particular lecture. So I will come back to this. But you just remember that if you make these two lists, one the Western and the other Indian, you will find them strangely lacking. And of course, when we talk about these this particular kind of literature, it may be literature of war, it may be literature of disease, literature of famine. There are several factors that we need to notice. One is literature is giving you the human perspective. Unlike history, unlike statistics, unlike even political texts, what literature does is to give you the human value. But giving that human value, the limitation that literature has to face is that it can't really give you a proper picture of the widespread devastation. Some do, some can, but mostly what it has to do is to look at it from a personal level. Even if there is an omniscient narrator, you have to focus on certain people, look at how they are negotiating with the events that are happening. And so what happens is you start to care about these individuals, and the mass scale destruction becomes secondary. And you care about whether this particular person dies or lives. And this is true of world literature, this is true of our partition literature, where widespread riots are shown. And it's not possible always to show the scale of destruction. And when I say it's not possible, I am not entirely right. It actually depends on the author, what the author is choosing. And the choice of the author depends on the politics of the author. And see, this is where we need to understand whether the text is propaganda, whether the text is a philosophical exploration, whether the text is a political exploration, whether it is simply a literary humanistic kind of a look at a grand event, positing certain characters against a grand event and trying to make sense of it. So there are so many variations possible. Now, what I'll do and talk about the text which does not belong to the concluding part of the last century. This is a text which belongs to the earlier part of the 19th century. Mary Shelley wrote this novel called The Last Man 8 years after Frankenstein was published. If I remember correctly, 1818 is Frankenstein, and this one is 1826. When I read that book, what I found fascinating, and this is where I will draw a parallel to the contemporary situation as well, what I found fascinating is how Mary Shelley is tracing the steps of a global pandemic, because as you know, I am sure most of you know about this particular novel, and this is, as the name promises, this is about the last surviving man on this planet, the last surviving human being. And what she does is that she shows how the onslaught of the pandemic was not taken seriously by the English population. They were joking, they were thinking, they thought that the plague will never come to London. So, and in fact, the far-flung places where the plague was functioning were practically unknown to these Englishmen. So they did not really care about those places. And when the plague came to certain areas of England, the other areas were merrymaking, celebrating, they were being happy, and they had this guilty consciousness that they were mocking what Mary Shelley says the sorrows of man. But there was this parallel. I mean, on the one hand, people were dying, on the other one, people were celebrating, they were having parties, they were having many kinds of celebrations, perhaps Facebook celebrations and etc. that we are seeing at this point of time. But this is something that she is foretelling. And the third one is that she is saying how the rules of order and laws are slowly disappearing as the disease is destroying mankind. The human values, the values that civilization has created over time, are slowly disappearing. Property rights, human rights, all these issues are disappearing. So what I find, why I went back to Mary Shelley, is that she is creating these valuable steps, a kind of a formula which even the 20th century literature is following. Now I'll just give you the steps. You just take a look at this, the steps, and then I will come to one earlier point and hopefully finish, because I have this habit of rambling on. Now if you look at that chart, you will see the 20th century novels, they follow either all the steps or they focus on certain steps of the chart. But that particular formula is followed. That becomes a kind of a stable paradigm for all such literature. Again, this is something that you can challenge me with. I sincerely hope that there would be objections raised. Now, I said that Indian literature does not really have a lot of literature on the pandemics, particularly Bengali literature does not really have a lot on them. I am not very sure about Hindi literature, but my searches did not really give me a lot of information about that. I could not really find a lot of texts in Hindi either, or in other Indian languages. But the thing is, there are so many epidemics that had been there in India. I mean, you could think of the flu epidemic of 1920, which had influenced India a lot. I might give you a chart. There had been so many famines and epidemics in Bengal. There have been, in 1896, there was a plague epidemic. Then tuberculosis was rampant during, even when Rabindranath Tagore was writing, even when our primary authors were writing. And but we don't really have texts which are entirely based on that. What we have instead are references to these epidemics, but the epidemic or pandemic or such things do not become the primary focus of these texts. And this kind of absence is quite striking, because the number of people that died in wars was much less than people who died. The number was much less than people who died in these diseases. So we don't have, and even in 1974, 1975, there was a huge smallpox epidemic in Calcutta. But our literature does not really reflect that. And again, take a look at this chart very briefly. See, the reason that I think is that we don't have much fiction on such topics is that you can roughly divide the world in two categories. There are countries which had a colonial past. I mean, not as the colonizer, but as the colonized. And a country like India, which is a post-colonial country, I mean, all countries, even the colonizers are now becoming post-colonial, not in that sense, but as a post-colonized country, our focus had been on creation of a new identity. In the last 50 years of the 20th century, Indian literature has mainly focused on that. And that post-colonial kind of obsession had somehow made us not think about such epidemics and pandemics. And because we are a post-colonized country, widespread death is not something that is surprising for us. Within the colonial paradigm, we have had colonially engineered famines, diseases, deaths. So for us, pandemics and epidemics did not really take that particular kind of significance that it did in European countries or in perhaps the United States of America, because they, being the colonizers, they were, I mean, the Great Plagues in London were there, but they were local compared to the pandemics that we are talking about. So to them, such things were much more calamitous than any other thing. War was something that they were habituated to. But to the Indians, this might be one of the reasons why we do not have a lot of such literature. And secondly, the this is the other controversial point that I am going to live in, that I want to just mention, that Indians have a greater sense of community than individuality. Again, this is a gross simplification. We are in the early part of the 21st century. India has progressed. But see, community is a different idea. So our approach to epidemics is a community-oriented approach, not an individual-oriented approach as such. This is no, I am just throwing this idea towards you. This is something that I am not trying to establish as such, but I would like you to think about these things. When you are dealing with the other texts, disease-related texts, you might want to think about this. But the final thing that I'm going to end with, the final observation that I'm going to end with, is that these disasters that we talk about on the individual human level, we look at the community being destroyed, the threat of the community being destroyed, that is the biggest threat. We talk about individual deaths, but we also talk about destruction of the community. And so, whose disaster? And all these literary texts, they talk about creation of dystopia post-apocalypse. This post-apocalyptic dystopia. There is no hope of creating a utopia after such widespread destruction. And the related issues of human rights, the related issues of equations of power, the all such issues of destruction, all that end up with the pessimism that I talked about at the very beginning. And the one thing I am not even touching here, because this would take hours, is that all these ideas of apocalypse, of epidemics, war, and the location of women in them, it becomes a completely different dynamic when we look at the world of women vis-a-vis this. So I am not really going to, I don't have any time left, so I'm not going to talk about that. But let me end by saying that fighting these epidemics, I talked about the responsibility of the state, but it's not merely the responsibility of the state, it's also the responsibility of the citizen, the individuals. So we have to cooperate with the state, we have to correct the state if necessary, we have to absolutely obey the state whenever necessary and fight together. And the responsibility of the citizen, the responsible citizen, is vital. And let me end by, I will give you a final quotation from The Last Man, and let me end by wishing you all a very safe future, a very good future. Please stay safe, stay healthy, do not disobey the instructions given. Let us fight and let us win. Thank you so much.